What is going on, Chess YouTube? In today's video, we are looking at game number 6 of the ongoing World Chess Championship match between Ding Liren of China, the defending world champion, and Gukesh D of India, the challenger. And here we go. In the game, Ding Liren is playing as white. Now, in the first two games playing as white, he did open one e4 and one knight to f3 against Gukesh. However, in this game, he does go one d4, the queen's pawn opening, and this is his favorite first move as white on the chessboard. Now, Gukesh, how does he respond? He starts one knight to f6, the Indian defense, very solid. And now Ding Liren, he mostly plays the move 2 c4 in this position. However, instead in this game, he does go 2 bishop f4, and this is the London system. And Ding Liren almost never plays the London. Yes, he did play it in his last World Championship match against Jan Nepomniachtchi. However, he rarely plays it as white, so this is a very interesting curveball by Ding Liren. Now Gukesh, how does he respond? He goes d5, the main move as black. Now here, Ding Liren, e3, and then Gukesh does go e6, perhaps intending a very fast bishop d6 or a fast c5. We'll have to wait and see what it's going to be. Now Ding, knight f3, and then sure enough, c5 for Gukesh. This is the main line for black. Now here, the main move for white in this position is going to be knight to d2. That is really the only move that does let white fight for an opening advantage. The problem with going, say, c3 immediately or bishop e2 is black can go for a very fast bishop d6, trading off these dark squared bishops, and black will have a relatively okay game. Now here, Ding Liren, I expected knight d2. We saw this quite a bit in the recent 2024 Candidates Tournament, and in fact, Gukesh here, in this exact position after knight d2, did go for the line, starting with queen b6, putting pressure on the pawn on b2. That line is very, very sharp. Now, instead, in this position, Ding Liren did go c3, and this move, it's solid, but it doesn't let white fight for a big opening advantage, because black can just go bishop d6 immediately. That is what he does. Bishop d6 on the board, simply challenging Ding Liren's dark squared bishop on f4, and here Gukesh is going to be relatively fine. Now, very importantly, on the prior move, if black went for a very fast queen b6, again targeting b2, the benefit of c3 is white can go queen c2, defending the b2 pawn with the queen on c2, and the queen is very well placed on the c2 square. So that is the main idea behind c3. But again, here, black just goes bishop d6, and he's doing just fine. Now, Ding, how does he want to proceed? You have many different playable moves here. For example, you can trade on d6 immediately. You can trade on c5. You can go bishop g3, simply offering the bishop trade on g3. That way, if black does take, you recapture with the g of the h pawn. H takes g3, opening up the h file. That could be dangerous. But instead, in the game, Ding does go bishop b5, putting immediate pressure on the king on e8. Now, Gukesh, how does he want to respond? He plays the main move, simply knight c6, not being afraid of the move bishop takes c6. If white does that, black just recaptures with the b pawn, b takes c6, and then the extra double pawn on the c file is not actually that weak. Black can always trade on d4, then go c5, getting rid of his double pawns, and again, black will be doing just fine. Now here again, Ding Liren has many different playable ideas. For example, bishop g3, short castles, queen to a4, and so on. But in the game, he does trade on c6, and this move also surprised me. So, bishop takes c6, then b takes is forced, and now Ding does trade on d6. Bishop takes, queen takes, and now a very interesting idea by Ding Liren, starting with the move queen to a4, putting pressure on that pawn on c6. Now, of course, black would like to go, say, c takes d4, then c5, again, getting rid of his double pawn, but that option is just, it doesn't work here as the pawn on c6 is pinned to the king on e8. Now, Gukesh, how does he want to respond? Well, he starts short castles, getting his king out of that pin. That is the best and most flexible move here, but now Ding shows his weird idea. He goes queen to a3. Now the pawn on c5 is pinned to the queen. Of course, if you go, say, c takes or c4, the queen on d6 will hang, and black will be losing on the spot. So black, of course, cannot do that. With that in mind, Gukesh, what's it going to be? Well, he has many playable ideas here as usual. For example, the pawn on c5 is being attacked. You can just go knight d7. That would be a very solid move. And the computer also says you can go, say, a5 or rook to b8, ignoring the threat of queen takes or d takes c5. That would be a gambit. And again, according to the computer, according to Stockfish, that is a playable idea as black. But instead, Gukesh finds the strongest move here, a move I did not expect. And once you see it, you do realize how strong it really is. That is the move knight to e4, jumping in with the knight, and now the knight does defend the pawn on c5. That way, if white takes on c5 with the queen or the pawn, say d takes c5, then queen takes c5, recapturing back with the queen would be extremely strong, and Gukesh would have virtually zero issues. He would have an extra pawn in the center, the open b file for the rook, and Gukesh might even be a little bit better in that scenario. So, of course, white, he does not want to take on c5. With that in mind, what's it going to be? Well, Ding Liren has many playable moves here. For example, you can just castle. That is perfectly fine. You can also go knight d2, challenging the knight on e4. And beyond that, even moves like knight e5, putting pressure on the pawn on c6 are also playable. Instead, in the game, Ding does go knight f to d2, retreating his f knight, putting pressure on the knight on e4. A solid move, but a little bit passive overall. And now Gukesh, he finds immediately the strongest way to try and equalize by force, to try to get equality in this game. But real fast, what are his options here? Well, Gukesh can trade on d2. Knight takes d2 is playable, but then after knight takes or even king takes, white is doing just fine. Beyond that, f5, bolstering the knight on e4 in the spirit of the Stonewall Dutch is also playable, but instead Gukesh finds maybe the strongest move here. That is the move e5, breaking in the center and putting immediate pressure on white's pawn on d4. Now, of course, his pawn triangle on d4, c3, and e3 is under attack. What is Ding going to do? Well, he starts knight takes e4, trading off knights, then d takes, and then queen takes c5, simply winning that pawn on the c5 square. And now Gukesh, what's he going to do? Well, you can take on c5, but that move would actually be a little bit dubious. After d takes c5, white is going to be up a pawn, and he does have that giant pawn mass of pawns on the queen side, and he could push his pawns down the board, say b4, a4, b5, and so on. And white may be able to get a pass pawn on the queen side very, very quickly. So overall, queen takes c5 would not be the right idea for Gukesh. Instead, queen to g6 was the move by Gukesh, putting immediate pressure on that pawn on g2. And now Ding, how is he going to defend? Very importantly, you cannot go short castle here. Then bishop h3 is incredibly strong. White is forced to go g3 to defend, and then you lose the new rook on f1. Of course, once you castle, the rook swings over to f1, and then bishop takes f1 would win the rook. So overall, short castles is not a good idea. It runs into the immediate bishop h3, which is basically winning for Gukesh. So with that in mind, how do you defend? Well, technically you can go g3 or rook g1, but those moves are just not very attractive. Again, white has to waste tempos to weaken his position. So instead here, Ding Liren, he's a fighter. He goes knight to d2, giving up the pawn on g2. And the idea is if you take it, he's got a long castle, and then his rook on h1 will be defended by the new rook on the d1 square. So that is what happens. Queen takes, then long castles, and again, the rooks now are connected. They are defending each other, and Ding Liren is doing okay. And we are going to have a very crazy opposite sides castling scenario where black might be attacking on the queen side and white may be attacking on the king side. All right, now, that pawn on f2 is hanging. Gukesh does take it. Queen takes f2, winning the free pawn. And now Ding Liren, the pawns on c6 and e5 are both hanging. White can take either pawn with the queen or the pawn on d4. So, for example, queen takes c6, queen takes e5, and d takes c5 or e5 are all playable. What does Ding want to do here? Well, let's go through the options one by one. If you take on the pawn on c6 with the queen, queen takes c6, then bishop g4 for Gukesh is very strong, flying in with the bishop, putting pressure on the rook, and from there, moves like rook c8 and rook b8 are coming, and black is going to have a tremendous amount of pressure. You don't necessarily want to trade on c6 right away, as again, that would open up the c file, and that is good for Gukesh. Now, instead, you can go queen takes e5, but the problem with that is the pawn on e3 would hang. Gukesh could just take there immediately, and then he would have a lot of pressure. Now, instead of those, Ding, he plays perhaps the safest move here. That is the move d takes e5, trading with the pawn, and now the benefit of this move, the queen has the discovered defense of that pawn on e3, meaning queen takes e3 is not a possibility. So Ding Liren finding the best and safest option. Now, Gukesh, how does he want to proceed? Again, with the opposite sides castling scenario, Gukesh is going to want to attack on the queen side as fast as he can. Now, what are the options? You can go queen d2, perhaps intending queen to d3 in the future. Beyond that, moves like bishop e6 and g4, developing the light squared bishop, setting up perhaps rook f to c8 in the future is also playable. But instead, Gukesh, he goes rook to b8, putting the rook on the open b file, pressuring b2, but giving up that pawn on a7 in the process. Ding will have the option of just queen takes a7, but of course, after say queen takes, then bishop e6, the bishop would be lining up with the pawn on a2, the rooks would be coming out. Gukesh could go rook to a8 in the future, and that would be very, very scary. So, of course, Ding here, he does not take on a7. He does not want to open up the a file for Gukesh. So, with that in mind, he's got to find something else. Now, what are the options? You can go knight b3, trying to blockade the b file, but then black, again, would have the option to say rook b5, a5, and a4, and so on. That would be scary. Instead, Ding can also go rook h to g1, lining up his own rook on the open g file against the black king. Of course, that would hang the pawn on h2, but that pawn is not that important. It is more important to open up lines against the black king, so that would be fine. Instead of those options, Ding does go knight to c4, jumping up with the knight. Now, what is the purpose of this move? Well, the knight does defend the pawn on e3. That is very important. Now, queen takes e3 is not a possibility, and that means the queen on c5 is free to move somewhere else. For example, it could go queen d4, threatening queen takes e4. It could go to d6 in the future, threatening the rook on b8, and so on. Now, here, Gukesh, how does he want to proceed? Well, one of the main problems with this position is that bishop on c8. It has to get out into the game, it has to develop, and it has to move so the rooks on b8 and f8 are connected. In the game, Gukesh does go bishop e6, a perfectly fine square for the bishop, and very importantly, here Gukesh has a deadly threat that would win the game on the spot. The threat, of course, is just bishop takes c4. Here's the idea. After bishop takes, if Ding does go queen takes c4, then queen takes b2 would be checkmate on the spot. Of course, the knight on c4 must stay there defending b2. If the knight goes, then queen takes b2 would literally threaten checkmate on the spot. So, of course, Ding has to defend somehow, some way. What are his options? Well, again, if you waste a move, you are getting checkmated. If you go knight d2, just retreating, then rook f d8 is very, very strong, putting pressure on that knight. You don't want to do that. And beyond that, if you go, say, b3 or b4, trying to defend along the b file, then queen takes a2 wins a pawn. That would also be deadly. So with that in mind here, Ding Liren, he only has one good move in this position to keep the game alive, and he does find it. That is the move rook to d2. Brilliant move by Ding, defending along the second rank with the rook and putting pressure on the queen on the f2 square. Now, Gukesh, where's the queen going to go? It has to go somewhere. Your main options are queen to h4, queen to f5, and of course, queen to f3. In the game, Gukesh does go queen to f3. That is the best square for the queen. And now Ding, how does he want to follow up? Well, first of all, his rook on h1 is under attack. It basically has to go somewhere. Now, where do you want to go? You can go to g1, putting pressure on the g file and the king on g8. Beyond that, rook h to e1 is also playable, defending e3, and rook h d1 can also be played, but that move is a little bit weaker as it does remove the defense of that pawn on e3. He's not defending it. So in the game, Ding does play rook h to e1, defending e3 with the rook, and again now, the queen is a little bit freer to move, as is the knight, so very good move by Ding. Now, Gukesh, he does trade on c4 here. Bishop takes c4, then queen takes, and now here, the best move for Gukesh to equalize is just rook b to d8, trying to get the rooks off the board. Then, for example, rook takes would be excellent for Gukesh. Now, instead, Gukesh plays maybe the first inaccuracy of the entire game. He goes queen to f5, retreating with the queen, but this gives Ding the chance to just trade on c6, winning that pawn. Queen takes c6 is the move, and now here Gukesh does go queen takes e5. That was his idea, but now Ding, queen to d5, offering the queen trade and centralizing his queen. And Ding Liren here, if we go into an endgame with, say, queen takes, then rook takes, Ding will have the advantage in the endgame thanks to his pawn majority on the queen side and his already passed pawn on the c3 square, and he would have the very, very simple plan of just pushing those pawns down the board as fast as he can. So, of course, queen takes d5 for Gukesh is not recommended. Instead, queen to e7 is played in the game. But now Ding Liren, he finds a very simple way to try and force either an endgame or a draw. He goes queen d6, again offering the queen trade, and again, trading queens is not recommended. Gukesh would have the inferior endgame. So, queen g5 for Gukesh, keeping the game alive. But now Ding, queen to d5 again, once again offering the trade of queens. Now Gukesh, queen e7, queen d6, queen g5, queen d5, and now Gukesh, if he goes queen to e7, that would be a draw on the spot, as that would be the third time both players have reached this exact position, and that would activate the threefold draw by repetition. Now, instead of going for the immediate draw with queen d7, Gukesh, he does play on. He's a fighter. He goes queen to h4. This is Gukesh showing he is playing for a win, but it turns out this move is slightly dubious, and queen to e7 was the correct idea, as now Gukesh is a little bit worse. Here, Ding Liren, rook e to d1, tripling up the rooks and the queens on the d file. Ding Liren is perfectly centralized here. Now, Gukesh, in this position, he does have to worry about back rank mating threats. For example, if he goes, say, rook b to d8, then queen takes d8 would decide the game on the spot. So with that in mind, it's very important for him to go either h6 or g6 here, giving his king a retreat square on the 7th rank if it needs it in the future. Now, Gukesh here does go g6, h6 also playable, both these moves equally good. Now, Ding Liren, the strongest move in this position is just c4, immediately pushing his pass pawn down the board, threatening c5 and c6. Instead, he does go queen to e5, playing safe and solid, and cutting off the king on this diagonal. Now here, Gukesh, rook b to e8, putting pressure on the queen, and we have queen to g3, offering the queen trade. This being the other idea of queen e5 on the prior move. And now, of course, if the queens come off the board, then Ding Liren will once again have the advantage in the endgame, thanks to his queenside pawn majority, and more importantly, that pass pawn on c3 that is ready to go marching down the board, c4, c5, c6, and so on. Now here, Gukesh, of course, he does not trade queens. He knows that is a bad idea. He goes queen to h5, keeping the queens alive. Now we have queen to f4 and then queen to a5, flying over to the queen side with the queen, threatening the pawn on a2. Now, Ding, how does he want to defend? His only two good options are a3 and king b1. Of course, ideas like b3 are not good. Yes, the rook does defend a2, then the pawn on c3 hangs, so that is a blunder. So instead, a3 and king b1 are the options. In the game, Ding does go a3. Very interesting, keeping the king on c1, and now we have this weird pawn formation on the queen side with all the pawns on the dark squares. All right, now, queen to b5 for Gukesh, threatening the light squares, threatening ideas like queen to b3, then maybe queen to a2 in the future. Now, Ding, rook d4, jumping up with the rook, and then sure enough, queen to e2, flying in with the queen all the way to the 2nd rank. Now, rook 1, d2, hits the queen, and now we have queen to f3, jumping into the f3 square with the queen, and now, very importantly, if Ding trades on f3, Black goes e takes f3, and he does have a very powerful pass pawn on the f3 square. That would give Gukesh a little bit of an advantage in the endgame. Therefore, trading on f3 is not recommended for Ding. Now, here, the strongest move for Ding, according to the engine, is queen at g5. It's a very active square for the queen, and beyond that, white is threatening ideas like h4 and h5, and the pawn on g6 would be pinned. Therefore, g takes h5 would not be possible. But instead here, Ding Liren, he does go king to c2, jumping up with his king, and now here, Gukesh, he finally does trade queens. Queen takes, and then e takes f4, and then f5, bolstering his pawn on the e4 square, and now we do have a roughly level endgame. The key difference with this endgame versus the other ones is Gukesh does have the very strong protected pass pawn on the e4 square, and that will give him enough counterplay against the pass pawn on c3 of Ding. Now here, Ding, in this position, he does go h4, gaining space on the king side, marching the alpha 0 h pawn down the board, but it turns out this move is actually a very big inaccuracy. Here, Gukesh has the option of going king g7, intending king h6, and then king h5, and believe it or not, the king would be very active on the h5 square. It puts pressure on the pawn on h4, and there's no good way for Ding to put pressure on the king. For example, yes, he could go rook g2, then rook to g5, but then king to h6, and the king is very safe on a6. So overall, this plan of king g7, then h6, then h5 would be very, very strong for Gukesh here, but instead in the game, he does go e3, pushing his pawn down the board. Now we have rook to e2, and then rook to e7. Now here, Ding, overall, he does have a small advantage in this position. That pawn on e3, believe it or not, is now a little bit of a weakness, and Ding does go king to d3, targeting the weak pawn. Now Gukesh rook f to e8, trying to defend, and now Ding, he goes for the move h5, marching the alpha 0 h pawn up the board. Of course, that pawn on e3 is defended for now. There are two attackers and two defenders. Therefore, the pawn cannot be taken yet. Now, h5 on the board, the alpha 0 h-pawn marching at the board, the threat being potentially h6. If Ding can get that in, he will have various back rank mating threats in the future. Now, Gukesh, he does not allow that. He goes g takes h5, and now we have the born-again alpha 0 h-pawn on the h5 square. That passed pawn may be a threat later in the game. It can threaten to go down the board h5, h4, h3, h2, and so on. Now here, Ding, rook d5, putting pressure on that pawn on f5, and now we have h4, the born-again alpha 0 pawn marching down the board. Now we have rook takes f5, winning the free pawn, rook d7 hits the king c2, and then king to g7. Material is still even in this endgame. Can either side get a win here? Let's find out. In the game, Ding does go rook g2, hitting the king, then king to h8, now rook to e2, once again pressuring the pawn, and now Gukesh, he just goes king g7, offering a draw if Ding Liren wants it, and he does go for it. Rook g2, king h8, rook e2, and then king g7, and this is the third time this exact position has arrived on the board. Therefore, it is a draw by the threefold repetition move in chess. So overall, both sides being very happy to go for a draw in this even endgame, and the game does end peacefully. Wow, what a game by Ding Liren and Gukesh. I mean, Ding Liren did go for a relatively passive opening, but he had some chances, and he actually was pressing for a good part in this game. So overall, I think both sides got what they wanted. Ding Liren got a very risk-free advantage out of the opening where he could press, and Gukesh, he did equalize, then he made some minor mistakes, and then finally corrected and equalized later in the endgame. So overall, very well played game by both players. Alright, Chess YouTube, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, smash that like button, and check out this video right here, where I cover Magnus Carlsen's latest Title Tuesday game against Alireza Firouzja from this past week. That game was incredible. If you haven't seen it, you must check it out. It was a beautiful attacking game, so check out that video, and I'll see you in the next video.